I work for Dow. One of my role was to lead the IT and ERP implementation for small and large programs globally. We have teams across all the regions, and I'm going to share my experience based on the work that we did, especially in the data readiness aspect, because we had teams that did business readiness, data readiness, and implementation all across Dow for small and large M&As. And I'm going to share my experience specifically for the journey that we took for the data readiness when we had to migrate from Dow to DuPont. So the challenge that I wanted to describe just a few years ago, you all probably heard that there was a big announcement that Dow was going to merge with DuPont. And that itself, being the size of the deal itself, spawned several remedy divestiture, which was required by the regulations. And you cannot really close the Dow-DuPont merge deal until you have buyers identified, the deal signed and closed in order to get to the Dow-DuPont merger. The deal itself was to merge and split. So Dow and DuPont was going to merge into one holding company called Dow-DuPont. And then upon merging, they were going to mix the portfolio of the like companies between the two companies and split into three independent companies that are actually today trading on its own on the stock exchange. So they were going to split into agriculture business, which is called Corteva today, material science business, which is the current Dow, and the specialty products business that became the DuPont company. On the exact same day when that was announced, Dow also purchased its share from Dow Corning joint venture, which is a 72-year-old JV, to bring the silicones business from Dow Corning into Dow. So that in itself would have been a huge news, but somehow that got a little bit sidetracked with the big deal that was announced between Dow and DuPont. So as you can tell, when the bottom portion of the slide was displayed, that created a pretty big deal for folks in the IT world to figure out how are we going to do that across both the companies. So I'm going to try to really describe what was all included in that, and how did we go about doing that. I think one point that I wanted to make, though, based on this morning's keynote speech, was about the importance of the M&A deals in these company strategies. So if you look at this particular deal, the synergy commitments to the market was in excess of $3 billion in run rate synergies between the two companies, plus $1 billion in the innovation, the growth synergies. The run rate had to be delivered 24 months post deal close. So that's where the pressure was to actually go and operationalize what was shown in the previous slide. So if you look at, I'm going to try to build this slide, so just bear with me. It's 4 years worth of work in one slide, and I actually authored it myself. So it's just I'll play with this, and I'll tell you exactly how complicated this is. So today we run on a single instance platform, ERP in the ecosystem that runs our entire enterprise globally. So when they said, well, they split out the Dow AgroScience business into ultimately what would go to Corteva, we would have to figure out a way to carve out the code base and the data specific to that particular business portfolio and separate it out such that we can move it into Corteva someday in future. Same thing with the specialty businesses that were owned by Dow. Not all of them, but a lot of them were put into deal. And that deal kind of kept on evolving. So some businesses were put in and then few were added. So figure out a way to carve and then move it to what would be a future DuPont. So that picture right there became a scope of the divestitures for us from a Dow perspective. At the same time, there were businesses that were coming from the DuPont company into Dow. The Dow architecture, our belief, and our philosophy is that we're going to harmonize it. When we buy a company, we bring their work, we bring their systems, their data, and get them over to Dow work processes. So that's a complete harmonization. And at the end, there would be, most of the stuff would be decommissioned unless it's absolutely needed to keep it on our platform. So that in itself is a big deal for us It puts a lot of effort to get it done right the first time when we bring it, because it's fully harmonized on day one. And the exact same thing for Dow Corning into Dow. The reason I'm not going to concentrate a lot on Dow Corning today, because it's highly complicated, because their OT integration with the IT is very complex, and I think to some degree it's a lot of the best practices that they have is highly recognized in the industry. So that makes up the deal itself here. So if you can kind of imagine this as what we had to do, how do we go about doing this when you have a global footprint, plants everywhere, warehouses, R&D, labs, facilities, offices, people globally? How are we going to do that? How are we going to carve out those things from Dow AgroSciences or specialty companies? And how are we going to do the data migration so that we can stand up these tenants, if you will, so they are fully functional? At the same time, what can we do to not disrupt the businesses? Because these businesses are running today, and they're still going to be running tomorrow when we actually carve it. We do not want to introduce any human change, because it's going to look or feel different. It needs to look exactly the same, but get it in a manner carved out so that we can then move it to the future company. So because of that, it required a complete rethinking of how are we going to do the data migration and the harmonization of what's coming in and what's going out. And that's when we decided that we're going to go and set up an enterprise data hub, which is traditionally not what we have done in Dow. We have done some big projects, big programs, where we do things on-prem and do the harmonization activities. But this is too big, because you can imagine like hundreds of systems, multiple ERP systems in different heritage companies. And if you constantly keep on going back at those systems, you're going to disrupt the current production enterprise environment. So that's why we decided to do this thing on an enterprise hub on a cloud. So this is a significant difference than what we have ever done before. Introduced challenges for us that we had not experienced before, but we knew that we had to do something fundamentally differently. That meant moving the data that is on-prem in Midland over the internet to the cloud, which is a pretty big deal, because once you do that, then you got to figure out how you're going to synchronize it, and what are you going to do to move the relevant data from those heritage systems from on-prem or the cloud and keep it synchronized without really impacting the bandwidth and taking resources that you would have typically done on-prem. So this, I mean, this took months, by the way, just that one little thing to figure out, but this was necessary to do that. Once we do that, we were not just allowed to just move the data. I mean, there's a lot of sensitive data, we have all these regulations. We got to figure out how do we do it in a secured manner. So we have a pretty stringent Dow security assessment that we'd have to go through, and moving the data out of the Dow premises over to cloud requires even stringent standards to meet and make sure that we are continuing to enforce the controls necessary to protect the data. So that was achieved. And once basically we had that thing working, the intent was to then carve out the data part of it. So I kind of threw this one out, and I know there's quite a bit of discussion on the digital twin yesterday, and to just maybe spark some questions. But what we did, spent a lot of time, we did not create an exact replication of the systems, because that was not necessary. Keep in mind that the entire thing was to not mess with the way the systems are running, but to actually pluck out the exact set of data that you need, all those 150 data objects that we need from here, and move that over to here. Once they were here in a raw store on the cloud, then you can do certain things that you could otherwise not do. If you do the transformation activity on the production system, then you're going to impact the way the performance of the systems are. So once the data was moved over here, we had flexibility then to do things that we would generally not do on-prem. So that allowed us to then say, okay, we have too many transformation activities going on, but we have a way to keep this data synchronized on demand or in real time. So then we took further cuts of it and then created these snapshots as you see over here. So if I'm transforming the data specifically to one particular business for one part of the SpecCo company, I could do that, and so on and so forth. And if we feel like the data in the snapshot, because it's point-in-time data, and if we need to bring in again, we could do the real-time synchronization on demand one time, and then create the new snapshot to continue to work on it and harmonize it. Predominantly, we use two different vehicles. One, and I'll talk about in the next slide, something called virtual data model, which is highly flexible. Actually, it's pretty awesome. So you can create a complete schema of the data for one business, do whatever you need to do, and then you have it. And if I then want to say, okay, now I did this for the one business, now the second business, which looks almost 90% the same, but is pointing to a different table for a few objects, you only have to modify that for those couple of objects. So that was one method. The other one is, just a Swiss Army knife, is the business object data services. Data services is like highly versatile. You can just about do anything when it comes to data. It's a little bit more complicated to use, but you can just about do anything you want to harmonize it. So once we had the secured way to synchronize, take the data out, do the snapshot, decide which tool works for you to do the harmonization. We did enrichment, extraction, deduplication, construction or mapping, and really profiling of all the data right there. So as you can see, all these clicks were happening in the cloud, and we were never touching the source systems. That's really critical because you're not really putting any pressure or dealing with latency or anything like that on the other side, which is, and your businesses are running like they're supposed to be running. So once you do that, once the mapping and all the profiling and all of that is done, then your data is ready to be loaded, basically. So that's a pretty big deal now, because now you have everything staged. It's on deck, ready to be loaded. And this is where you're about to introduce the risk back into the target system or the production system, which is a very complex process for us. We don't take it lightly. We have multiple test cycles that happens before we do that. But before we actually do the loading of it, we know that we would have to then parse from the internet back into the Dow environment, and that is a latency-heavy process. So actually, before we do a production, what we call a production load of the data, we would do a complete real-time simulation. Complete real-time simulation of every single data object as if we were doing a live cutover. So we would say it takes 108 hours to cut over based on our experience, let's say for a Dow Corning business. Then we would sequence every single data object for duration of the time and do a complete real-time simulation and learn from it. Most of the loading would work, but we would learn something that, hey, this didn't work, that didn't work. There were some interesting issues that would pop up, and I'll explain in the next slide. But the simulation is a big deal. And then the little icon about the dashboard is that we have a real-time dashboard that would monitor the progress of it minute by minute, hour by hour, and users who are doing it would know what they need to do to actually execute it. That's done, then we would do a final user acceptance testing to make sure that the loading of the data, the simulation yielded in the right results for us to then actually go and set up a complete working separate system, includes the data and the functionality, into a separate tenant. So Corteva had one, and we created a separate one for DuPont. So if you can imagine now on the Dow network, we have this single instance system that runs the rest of the Dow, and then we have two separate instances of Corteva and DuPont running still on Dow. Users are logging in. They get the instructions to, hey, log into here versus there, but they cannot feel anything different. It looks the same, feels the same like what they did before, and it's ready to go. So once we had that, then you know that we were able to stage this thing, what we call lift and transfer. This thing is still on Dow. We're ready to lift it and transfer it. Then it would go to the buyer or the other company's network, and then basically do another weekend cutover, shift the Corteva tenant over to Corteva company, do SpecCo tenant over to DuPont company, and of course, anything that we acquired here from DuPont, we would do that and bring it over to Dow. So So this is the process that we used. There were a lot of learnings from it. This wasn't easy by any means. We have ran into issues in the stability of the environment. We ran into a lot of learnings from the synchronization part of it, and of course from the simulation. So this is kind of 3.5, 4 years worth of work that the teams did. But all of this is actually done. 3 companies are trading today on NYSE, just like what they had promised. So I'll quickly go and talk about some of the advantages and the results that we have achieved. So I talked about the real-time replication in cloud, and that provided the instant visibility to the source system data. I cannot emphasize importance of this particular item, but there's a catch. People can get overzealous and say, hey, I want real-time all the time. That would put significant pressure on your source systems or your network. So when we got first time, when it worked, we were excited to turn it on, and then everything started crawling. Like, where is this demand coming from? And this particular routine was causing it. So you got to figure out what's right for you. No network latency was obviously a huge plus because you're doing all the work and you're not putting any pressure on your enterprise system. The hardware storage reduction, this is also a big benefit because you're only migrating the relevant data and relevant historical data. And this is where we learned, we used to kind of migrate all the data, and then when you're about to load it, it would take a long time. For instance, maintenance work order is a good example. And it always used to kill us, like, what's going on? Because you had so many closed orders that you were trying to load, and that's not really critical path item, right? So we had figured out that, hey, we can segregate it when you take the snapshot and push that one out or load it earlier versus loading the transactional data that's needed over there. Centralized data management was also a big advantage because you're preventing the data proliferation. When you see the set of data that you're working on, you have 50 to 100 developers working on it, they exactly know that this is the right data for that business and that event. And if I just get this thing right, then my test event is going to go right. You're not messing with anything else. So that's a big part of it. User adoption, the business user adoption is also a big deal because it's not all about IT. This is where the OT comes into play. Most of the data objects are manufacturing or supply chain, purchasing, finance. So you need experts from those functions to actually go and sanitize the information and make sure that it's right. And we gave them a ton of tools. So we have a lot of reports that were ready for them to use, customized for each object. One of my favorite one is missing config. I mean, for years, we would get beat up when we try to load data and it fails. And we were like, what happened? We spent so much time trying to figure out that it needs to work and it didn't. You're trying to load data onto a target system for a plan that's not configured for some reason. Somebody forgot or didn't extend it, and then you load it. There's absolutely zero things that was wrong with the load routine, actually. But because you didn't have a simple thing that was configured, it just killed the whole thing, and then everything else just comes to a screeching halt. So we have these dashboards that are built in that would give you earlier predictions that, hey, if you don't have this objects configured in this sequence, all of these things are going to fail. So it's a huge deal and a big deal that helped us cut out significant amount of time to do the work. VDM, I talked about it. VDM is pretty cool. I gave one example of how you can cut the time from schema. But like some objects, if you configure from one business to the other, it could take like 7 days to do it, but if you just copy an object that was working and just change the configuration where it's necessary to meet the new requirement, we have cut down from days to hours. So this was a big deal. I would like to see more and more usage of this VDM technology as we get more mature in our migration. And then I talked about the data services, which is really a powerful tool because it's just not the ERP system alone. You have data that's in many of the other systems that are non-SAP centric, and you're going to have to figure out a way to move that over to cloud and then use this particular utility to do the transformation that you need to do. In loading, obviously, the previous picture was there were so many businesses that were involved in the deal. We would have precisely 4 weeks to do a load cycle. Not one more day, 4 weeks. If you can get one less day, then it's fine. So you have to get that sequence super tight to get it done in 4 weeks. And we were able to do that. Towards the tail end, when we were finishing up the last of the migrations, we were actually pretty good, where we would be finishing a day or two earlier to get it ready for the big test event and the production loads to go for the cutover and the go live. The last bullet is really the biggest payoff because we were able to predict through the simulation that we could cut down some time, but we have cut down as much as 2 days. 2 days, if you can think of going to the business ahead of time and say, hey, I need a blackout for 108 hours. So, you can manufacture, but you cannot ship. They'll say, okay, well, I get it. I know what we need to do. But that gives you exact timing for them to come up with the backup processes that they need to do to keep things moving. But imagine that you're giving the systems back. You're giving the systems back as promised globally in exact same time frame or a few hours earlier. By doing this, what we have done, we have cut down as much as 2 days at sometimes. 2 days is a huge benefit for us. And I'm really pleased to report that we did all of this work for all of the transformation, and knock on wood, wherever it is, we did not cause any disruption to the businesses globally. Neither companies did, So really a big deal and a good achievement, great achievement, I said, for the teams. I'm not going to go through all of this, but the possibilities of applying this are significant. If you look at the central data architecture, the governance, that we put so much effort in creating the governance, really, to make sure the data remains secure and actually do what we need to do in terms of transformation. It can apply to many of these use cases, and all of these are actually being worked on at Dow today. So many things in IoT, the data integrity security, sensors and drones. Billy talked about that yesterday. A lot of these things are happening in our DOC center that Clark leads. We are doing the business process modeling. My team's actually doing that mining work to figure out, can we do that? Data is at the center of it. Security, I talked about the fact that how could you use this agile architecture and still be comfortable that your data is secured. Profiling is the last thing that I'd cover. Data profiling is a big deal. We have other tools that we introduced that would quickly profile the data and tells you, hey, the source system looks like this, the target needs to look like that. But then we were like, okay, then we had to go manually fix something. Towards the end, when we were getting really good at loading the data, we applied one use case in the machine learning, this Python-based, which actually was, we were comparing like manual, a human doing the decision versus the machine, and machine was actually giving us the probability that, hey, if you have 3 records, this should survive and these 2 should be killed, like in, let's say, customer master. That thing was really, really good. So we would want to invest more time into it because we have specific use cases where I think we can even get better at that. So really, that's my speech here, and I wanted to share some of those learnings from Dow experience. Thank you.